Well, welcome to Grant's Interest Rate Observer of the Air. I am Jim Grant. And I was about to say, with me as always, is the great deputy editor of Grant's, Evan Lorenz. But Evan is not here. Evan has traveled to the Arctic. No, I thought the air conditioning in the office was sufficiently chilly that you didn't have to go that far, but that's where he's going. We published our final issue of this season yesterday on Tuesday, July 25th. And here it is, Wednesday, the 26th, and we are awaiting, some of us more breathlessly than others, the word from on high, from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will alert us to its plans for us and for the American enterprise. And I think it's awfully good of them to go to work today on a summer day and take time to guide us in this. No, I don't think that. Sarcasm doesn't really work when there's no one to share it with. I can share it with Martin Hutchinson, our guest. I'll introduce Martin in one moment. Before we get down to business, I want to thank Harrison Woodill, who was at the control panel. Harrison ordinarily runs this business, and today he's running the podcast. So well done, Harrison. Yeah. And what else must I say? Oh, yes, we're having a conference. It is the 3rd of October. We'd have one once a year, and this is the 2023 event. And it's a rather special one because this commemorates and celebrates 40 years of continuous publication for Grants. 40 years. Now, I know long bonds that mature in fewer than 40 years is a round lot of years. And I think that many of you ought to be there. In fact, I dare say that everyone ought to be there, and some of you, I hope, will be. The speakers include Harrison. Am I right in saying this lineup is unprecedented in its all-around luster and accomplishment and knowledge and wealth and good looks? Is that correct?
Very much so.
Yeah, yeah. It includes David Abrams, Harley Bassman, David Einhorn, Jeffrey Gundlach, Michael Partnett, Paul Singer, and a new recruit for this project, David Dredge, who is the founder of Convexity Capital. He's in Singapore, and David has the Bank of Japan's number. He's going to be here to tell us about all manner of things having to do with monetary affairs and their mismanagement. And speaking of the mismanagement of monetary affairs, we have with us today, ladies and gentlemen, an authority on that. And his name is Martin Hutchinson. And Martin is a formidable man. He is, in the first place, he's a mathematics alumnus of University of Cambridge. For all I know, a Wrangler. I don't know that. We'll get into that, I suppose. And we're going to assume that until proven otherwise. He is an alumnus of the Harvard Business School, where he earned an MBA. And he began in his career, I think, in finance. He'll clarify if not. And worked for many years, I think a quarter of a century perhaps, in such outfits as Hill Samuel, Citigroup, and Skilled Securities. I think that's in Sweden. We Americans don't know much about life outside the 50 states, but I think Sweden is a country, right? Yeah. Yeah, and he was involved in Spanish banking and especially in Croatia in the 1990s. Anyway, Martin then got the light, and the light is financial journalism. Now, from Daniel Defoe on down to Martin Hutchinson, the financial journalist has been the place to be if you are especially, what's the word I'm searching for? Accomplished, I think is the word I was looking for. And that certainly describes Martin. And Martin is here because, among other things, first of all, he's the author of something called True Blue Will Never Stain, The Bear's Lair. It is a Monday publication, Monday being the gloomiest day of the work week, says Martin. And it's a Monday essay that one must read. And Martin is also the author of Forging Modernity, among his other books. This is the new one, Why and How Britain Developed the Industrial Revolution. And Martin, if he's like some of us, is wondering when I will stop introducing him and let him say hi. So Martin, hello.
Hello. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. Well, here for Martin, I think, is Poughkeepsie, New York. Is it not, Martin?
That's correct. So I'm just up the road from you.
Yes. Well, I want to ask you about some of the following things. I want to ask you about the thinking that led you into recounting the history of the Industrial Revolution and much more in Forging Modernity, just out. I want to ask you about the Bear's Lair and some of the ideas that I've read there, and in particular, the idea about how one ought to dress to promote a solvent and prosperous banking system. I would like to talk about the heroes that you have encountered, including Lord Liverpool and Henry IV of France, and Thomas Newcomen, the inventor of some kinds of steam engines, and about some of the anti-heroes that you have written about, including Cardinal Richelieu and John Law. John Law, I think, is a great uncle of Ben S. Bernanke, PhD. So, Martin, tell us, first of all, if you would please, how a man who was prospering in the city of London and outside it, and for all I know, was about ready to make the Forbes 400 list of the wealthiest people ever, how this individual chose to go into the penitential order of financial journalism. What got into you?
Well, this was, 23 years ago, and I was an international banker, so we never made the kind of money that the Wall Street guys do with all their big deals. I used to specialize in emerging markets and then eventually ended up, firstly, as US Treasury advisor to the Republic of Croatia. And then, since the Minister of Finance liked me, I ended up running corporate finance for Privredna Bank of Zagreb. And it was all enormous fun, but when that job came to an end, there didn't seem to be any more fun jobs in Eastern Europe. So I had to sort of switch tracks rather quickly and ended up as financial journalism, not realizing that Daniel Defoe ended up in debtor's prison, which is not a good precedent.
I see, yes. Well, that does happen to some of us. I dare say, Martin, there are fewer fun jobs in Eastern Europe today, even than when you left the place. Would that be a correct conjecture?
I think that's absolutely right. The 1990s were great fun there because you were, as Hutchinson wrote in his autobiography, you were present at the creation. So you were building capitalism from nothing, and there was at least some chance of doing it right.
Yeah.
Although inevitably the aid agencies, particularly the European FAR program, came in and messed it all up. But for a few years there, we had some fun.
Yes. Well, you certainly came prepared, educationally speaking, for whatever lay ahead. Mathematics is not my strong suit by any means, so I'm always impressed by, especially a Cambridge mathematician. I am also impressed by a biographical note you dropped into the Bear's Lair, which is that, if I'm quoting you correctly, that even at the age of 17, you had entertaining utterly inappropriate or outre or absolute inadmissible ideas. And I would like you to tell the listeners to Current Yield, Martin, if you can recall what some of these ideas were. What were the ideas that would have, say, prohibited you from a successful application to Harvard College or other institution of higher learning in this country?
Well, I remember at a dinner party on December the 31st, 1969, with the brashness of youth, I announced that decade would in the future be known as the silly 60s because it had been a complete disaster for all levels of civilization. And while I slightly retract that now, it was certainly a contrarian view at that time.
Yeah.
And it was because the comfortable world of Britain's 1950s, which was nothing like as affluent as the American 1950s, seemed to me to have been eroded unnecessarily rapidly.
Yes. So that was one deeply suspect opinion that you entertain. But as I read you, and I read you closely and with great pleasure, Martin, but as I read you, you are seemingly a born capitalist. You are a born Tory. Your contempt.
In the 18th century sense of that word, yes.
No, yes, of course, the proper sense. Properly contemptuous as a Tory might be of the Whig Party. And so where did that come from? Because I think it helps before we get into some of these writings to know a little bit about the author's approach to life and his set of ideas. So where are these? Were you a born capitalist and a born 18th century Tory, or did these things come to you at a moment of revelation later in life?
They came to me. I mean, I guess one develops one's ideas as a teenager. The Britain in the 1960s and 1970s was a pretty sort of depressing environment in the sense that there were all sorts of indicators of national decline, and one of them was the fact that the Conservative Party wasn't doing anything that would remotely be called conservative, or it wasn't even conserving what it had, let alone trying to return to a previous better phase. And so I started looking back, and I discovered that the one leader that nobody talked about, who'd led the Tory party for 15 years, was Lord Liverpool.
Yes.
And I ended up in the 70s writing a book called Great Conservatives, which took me 25 years to get published, and then not very successfully. And Liverpool was one of those. And I sort of defined conservatism as what people believed when Liverpool was Prime Minister, because that's actually the original definition. The word was first used in the January 1830 Quarterly Review, and that's what it meant. It meant the follower of that Tory government, which by that stage wasn't Lord Liverpool's. He'd recently died, but the Duke of Wellington was still carrying on the continuation of it. And in January 1830, they didn't know the government would fall in November 1830.
And that was also sorry, Martin.
So that was the definition of conservatives. And I thought, if you use that as your definition, who were the great conservatives? And I wrote that book, and then focused more closely on Lord Liverpool later on, and decided to write a biography of Lord Liverpool when I took out writing biographies, which was really after I retired from my day job, in the sense that I decided I didn't want to work for anybody else anymore, and so I'd try and write books. And the Lord Liverpool biography, Britain's Greatest Prime Minister, which is a stretch, but not that much of a stretch. In other words, he's certainly among the top 3 or 4.
Yes. I was struck by, in your new book, Forging Modernity, Why and How Britain Developed the Industrial Revolution, I was struck by your sense of the timeline of progress and retrogression. And progress is certainly clear enough. It began after the restoration of the monarchy with what Charles II, I suppose, would have been late in the 17th century, and it proceeds through the 18th. And then you tell us in great detail, much of it engrossing, how the Industrial Revolution was formed and how it proceeded, and what supported it, what ideas supported it. And then we come to the turn of the 19th century, and you identify the year 1830 as the height, the apotheosis of the Industrial Revolution. I would have guessed, not knowing much about this, I would have guessed that the peak was rather later in the 1800s. But you make a very good case that it occurred in 1830, and you identify the moment by describing a fateful railway accident. And I would like you to tell our listeners about the year you chose, 1830, and why this particular railway accident kind of crystallized the peaking of the powers that provided us with the great gift of the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, well, the Tory government that Lord Liverpool had run from 1812 to 27, he had a stroke in February 1827 and was then out of politics thereafter. And they had a couple of short-lived middle-of-the-road governments under Canning and Goderich. And then the Duke of Wellington took over in January 1828, who was a fine conservative by all means, but not entirely suited to politics, shall we say, in the sense that he wasn't good at the sort of mental maneuvering you need to do to figure out what's going to fly and what's not going to fly and how to sell it best. And he ran the government for nearly 3 years, till November 1830. But during his term of office, both wings of the old Tory party split off. The Canningites, as they were then called after Canning, the Liberal wing, split off in May 1828 because they didn't agree with his fiscal policy, and also disliked him personally as being a representative of the more conservative Tories. And then he decided to pass Catholic emancipation, which was a political hot potato that had been around ever since the union with Ireland in 1801. And the trouble was that the Whigs were generally in favour of Catholic emancipation and the Tories generally against. And so by passing Catholic emancipation, which he did with his deputy Peel, he then peeled off the other wing of the Tory party, the ultra conservatives, the people who didn't want to give Catholics not the vote. In fact, they already had the vote, at least in Ireland, but representation in Parliament and such. And so, therefore, I don't know if you ever saw the Monty Python series, but there's an episode in that in which the Black Knight has his arms and legs chopped off but keeps on fighting. And that was essentially Wellington's government in its last year, because it was a Tory party with both wings removed. And so it only had a tiny majority, even though Liverpool had done a very good job in 1826 and got a good majority elected, but splitting the party both ways at once inevitably left it unstable. And then George IV died, so you had to have a general election. And at the general election, they lost another few seats. And at that stage, they could only stay in if they got one or other of their split bits back, if you see what I mean. The people who hated Catholic emancipation were furious with Wellington personally for pushing it through, so they weren't going to come back quickly. So therefore, you had to do a deal with the moderate liberals, the leader of which was William Huskisson, who was a very well-known economic figure. He'd been president of the Board of Trade. He'd worked with Liverpool on the resumption of the gold standard in 1819.
Strong
He'd
gold
done all the
standard man,
trade.
no?
Hmm?
Strong gold standard man was Huskisson.
Strong gold standard man, yes, absolutely. And people, he's a major figure. At my school in the 1960s, they had a Huskisson Society, and that's 135 years after he died. So that's how important he was, because people admired him as a great economic thinker. And anyway, he and Liverpool needed to do negotiation. The best place to do that was the opening of Britain's first major railway, the Liverpool and Manchester, because Huskisson was MP for Liverpool, and the Duke of Wellington, as Prime Minister, came up to the opening, which was much more of a schlep for him than it would be for us, because, of course, there were no railways, so it was basically a sort of 3-day coach journey. And they all got on the train amidst much cheering. And then, about halfway along, the train stopped to take on water. And various of the guests got off, and not knowing about these railway things, they stood on the other of the two lines. And Huskisson came up to have a chat with Duke of Wellington. They were supposed to be negotiating a return of Huskisson to the cabinet. And unfortunately, the Stephenson's rocket came by at the unprecedented speed of 30 miles an hour, so much faster than anybody was used to. And Huskisson tried to scramble into the Duke of Wellington's carriage, but couldn't do it. He was 60 and overweight. And Stephenson's rocket took his legs off, and he died about 10 hours later. It's all very sad. And that changed everything, because it meant that Wellington couldn't get either the ultra conservatives or the moderates back in his government. And so when they met Parliament in November, the Whigs won the first major division and took power. And the Whigs were then in power and gerrymandered the electoral system by the 1832 Reform Act. And so, Britain's system of government changed. And while there were following governments that called themselves conservative, they didn't follow the precepts of Lord Liverpool, partly because Peel, the next leader, who'd been Home Secretary under Liverpool, had the opposite approach to economics. Liverpool had believed that you need high wages in order to force progress, because high wages mean that it's very efficient to bring in labor-saving machinery, and therefore even labour-saving machinery that's rather expensive and inefficient, you'll adopt it as soon as you can. Whereas Peel believed in low wages and high profits. His father ran a sweatshop in the textile industry and made £1 million by doing it. But Peel's approach then led to the repeal of the Corn Laws and later 18th century British policy, which meant that the forcing element that made Britain an industrial leader was taken away.
So has the world been in decline since 1830?
The rest of the world, no. I mean, Europe and then the rest of the world's been catching up and eventually overtaking. But I think it's reasonable to say that Britain has been in decline since 1830.
And what is it about the Industrial Revolution that we have lost? What ideas created it, and which of those ideas has now fallen into disrepute, or at least unfashion? What are we looking at with respect to the intellectual grid that provided the opportunities for all of this growth? And what have we?
Well,
what did we have?
Some of the Industrial Revolution's ideas we've still got. I mean, one of the things that I think was necessary is the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and in particular Bacon's inductive method of reaching new scientific conclusions. So you form a hypothesis, figure out an experiment to test it, and then the results of the test make you modify the hypothesis.
Right. So scientific method was right. Okay, that's a bedrock. And
yes, that's the bedrock.
And rights of property, is that how important is that?
And the other one is rights of property. Yes, but the scientific revolution we've still more or less got. But the rights of property, we don't have anything like the strength they had in the 18th century. Liverpool used to get up in the House of Lords and give speeches explaining how property rights required this, and they were extremely important and all the rest of it. You don't hear politicians doing that now. They've just gone out of public discourse. And what's happened, I mean, regulators and bureaucrats in general infringe on private property all the time.
Yeah.
And the result is that it's much more difficult to gamble your life savings and everything else on some new venture with the hope that you'd be allowed to keep the results if it was profitable. And those early Industrial Revolution people were taking a huge risk, and indeed not making all that much in the way of profits, but at least they got to keep what they made.
Well, certainly the powers of Silicon Valley seem to be still thrusting despite the decline and fall of Silicon Valley Bank. I mean, the idea of innovation certainly is not foreign to us, nor is the idea of enterprise. Invention, ditto. So are we, in fact, in a good place or a bad place with regard to the underlying capitalist dynamics in this country? Let's take America.
Yes, no, it's easiest to look at the United States, largest free market economy and all that. I think we've come a fairly long way from it in that property rights are nothing like as respected now as they were. I do think, and I think that a lot of the innovation in the tech area in particular, which has been fueled by the massive private equity in the last 20 years, has been pretty trivial or indeed damaging. I would suggest that social media was actually a damaging innovation in terms of lowering everybody's hedonic GDP, if you want to invent that statistic.
Or taste.
And I think the sort of ability of the quick buck is still there, but Industrial Revolution wasn't quick bucks. Thomas Newcomen spent 10 years trying to figure out how to make a steam engine work before he got one to work, and he didn't die a rich man at all.
The scientific method, induction, performing a hypothesis, testing it, all these things describe science, real science, but there is a kind of flourishing pseudoscience, perhaps you'd agree with this or maybe not, that we call macroeconomics. Certainly monetary economics has plenty of mathematical symbols, the appendices to the Federal Reserve studies that pour out of the Eccles Building in Washington and other outposts of monetarist thinking. these things are, it looks to me, just not knowing much about mathematics, that somebody there at least has studied calculus, and yet these propositions by the monetary economists seem unfalsifiable. They seem ungrounded in empiricism. They seem not actually to be working very well, yet they do seem to be persistent. How is it that the ideas of science have corrupted political economy and have given us the central bank I was about to say monsters. The central banks that the world over have been that central banks have been suppressing interest rates and otherwise cluttering up free market with their ideas and policies. Why has science lost its way and then moved into economics?
Well, I think partly it's because it's politically attractive, of course, to expand the money supply continually. And I mean, you can read Lord Liverpool in the parliamentary debates around the resumption of gold. And indeed, while Britain had paper money from 1797 to 1819, and he was determined that paper money should only be issued by the Bank of England. As a private organization, it would decide to issue the number of notes that it wanted to issue.
Hmm.
And therefore, there was still a market control over the money supply.
Yes.
And, you know, if government asked it to issue notes, it could say no, and indeed would if it wasn't in its interests or it thought it was endangering itself. And Liverpool made that point very specifically in sometime before they went back on the gold standard. But I
Right.
was struck by.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, Martin, if you would tend to agree with the proposition that in matters of monetary affairs, the history of the past 150 or so years has been one of retrogression. Let me quote from a book of which I'm very fond. It is Bray Hammond's Banks and Politics in America. And it's a history of monetary policy and banking from about the Civil War to the 1950s when Hammond was writing. And here's a quotation from a Kentucky banking official. Agrarian Kentucky came up with this notion. It's a report on regulation, and here is what the Kentuckians said a couple hundred years ago. Quote, bank paper is not capital, but credit. Bank paper being credit, purity of which depends upon its always being met upon demand, is from its nature designed to circulate and exchange the annual and marketable products of industry, and is therefore an unfit subject for long loans and permanent investments, period, close quote. So here is the doctrine of short-dated credit. I guess some people would stigmatize it as the real bills doctrine, but it is an expression of the idea that there is a distinction to be drawn. One must distinguish between capital on the one hand and credit on the other. These distinctions have gone by the boards, and we see these banks, some of which recently passed into the netherworld. We see them making very, very long-dated loans on inherently and necessarily illiquid assets, namely mortgages and real estate. And I am beginning to sound like a guy who is shouting at young people to stay off his lawn, Martin. But I think that you might have done some shouting along this in the same. But what?
I've done a lot of shouting over the last 20 years.
Yes,
Yes.
but all this was in service of a question. The question of which is escaping. But I guess the question is, ain't that right? And it tickles me that these that the citizens of Kentucky would have expressed such an important idea with such economy of language and such precision. And you can read your eyes out with the emissions from the commercial banks, the oligopolistic commercial banks of the present day, and goodness knows from the central banks of the present day, and see nothing so cogent as this. So we have gone from a system of elegance and simplicity to one of complexity and dysfunction. And no one says nothing about it or about the paradox of progress moving backwards in this most essential business of lending and borrowing and money.
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, the the lovely thing is that the 18th century working classes appeared to have understood fairly well what was wrong with printing infinite quantities of money. Because when Britain went off the gold standard in February 1797, which they had to do because they were running a huge budget deficit that year, Pitt was not a very good
Well, they were
financial
fighting a war
manager.
with revolutionary France,
And they
of
were
course.
fighting war
Yes,
with
yeah.
France, and indeed France invaded the French invaded Wales, which is what finally
But
caused
nobody
them to go
objected
off
to
the
that in
gold
England,
standard.
did they?
Mhm.
Nobody objected to that in England. Here's
No, no,
Wales,
no.
take it. Oh, no, never mind.
Wales was
No.
part of the
Yeah,
country.
I
It
know,
sent
I know.
MPs to
But if
Westminster.
if the Russians invaded New Jersey, who like so take it,
Yeah,
please.
that's about the equivalent.
Yeah.
Now, anyway, the famous British victory at the Battle of Fishguard um, removed the French from
Yeah.
Wales. They all surrendered. It was a sort of bunch of local yokels and
Right.
a few militia.
Okay. Okay.
But that went nowhere. But the point I was making was that when we went off the gold standard in 1797 and went to the Bank of England printing notes, um, everybody said, well, in London, people are going to understand because they're sophisticated. They're going to understand that the government is creditworthy. But how are ordinary people out in the country going to understand? And it was obvious that they probably wouldn't. And so Charles Jenkinson, Liverpool's father, who was president of the Board of Trade, put together a scheme of printing penny and twopenny pieces in copper, which Britain had because they had a large copper mine in Anglesey. We didn't have to import it. And those pieces would be so heavy that they would actually be worth their stated value. So there were 1 pence and 2 pence, and their copper value was just about the same as their nominal value. And so, and the working classes, who of course 1 pence and 2 pence was the normal thing they used, they didn't throw sovereigns around much, um, would therefore be able to pay each other and receive their pay and so on with these new coins and feel happy they were getting full value because the copper was actually worth it. If they melted it down, they'd have an ingot that was worth something. And effectively, therefore, Charles Jenkinson put working class Britain onto the copper standard for a couple of years in the late 1790s, after which confidence was recovered. But it's a very interesting experiment. And it's very interesting that Charles Jenkinson, at any rate, believed that working class Britain would see something that was bullion backed, even if it was copper bullion, not um, gold or silver, and therefore be happy that the money was still worth something.
Yes. So before leaving the Industrial Revolution, I want to call the attention of our listeners and to remind myself of the existence of one of the few geniuses in our particular line of work, Martin, and that is Daniel Defoe, who wrote, of course, the immortal Robinson Crusoe, but he wrote a lot of financially themed pamphlets, and he wrote something, as you quote here in your history, a tour through the whole island of Great Britain. And this was 1724-ish, 25. And what I thought was so interesting is that Defoe, a curious guy whose intelligence is expressed in part in his insatiable curiosity, he wrote down the details of everyday life and work, and those details brought to life that's, as you put it here, that specialization, mechanization, and deeply rooted knowledge of processes and techniques was already highly developed before the Industrial Revolution proper really got a running start. So people knew what they were doing. They were competent. They had skills. And those skills were awaiting, I guess, energy, organization, and technology. But tell us about the leap from Defoe's observations to the decades that followed, that finally peaked, as you say, in this apotheosis of 1830. This is a rather open-ended question, but if you could give us the 3-paragraph answer to this 100 years, how did the people from Defoe's tour, the observation. How did all of this yield this great benefaction that we call the Industrial Revolution? How did this come to be?
Well, Defoe's tour already makes it clear that even in 1724, Britain was different to anywhere else on the continent. That difference wasn't universal historic. In 1600, Britain wasn't different. I mean, it was different in certain respects, better in some, worse than others, but there was no reason. If you looked around the Europe in 1600, as I did in a preliminary chapter, Britain wasn't where you would think an industrial revolution would spring
Mm.
up. Your best bet would have been France under Henry IV, who actually wanted to make the peasants richer, which isn't a normal view of French government, but for some reason he had it. And there are a number of cases of British entrepreneurs being thwarted in England because Queen Elizabeth, like Catherine the Great of Russia 2 centuries later, believed that machinery was a bad thing because it put people out of work.
Biden thinks that in
And
some
so they
respects.
went off to
Yeah.
France and got patents there and set up businesses there. And of course, that all came to an end when Henry IV was assassinated in 1610 and was fairly shortly afterwards was succeeded immediately by Louis XIII, who was a boy. But in terms of running the place, Cardinal Richelieu, who came in about 1618, believed that the peasants should be kept firmly subjected and the church should be exempted from much of the taxes. And that's what gave you the very unequal and unproductive society of 18th century
Mm.
France. That and a financial crash in 1720. But in Britain, um, they had the same sort of half-baked approach to innovation in the early 18th century. In other words, you tended to innovate when you were given a royal grant. But the interregnum, to do it credit, broke that up and pushed Britain a long way towards the Netherlands, which was already having a commercial society. And then when the Restoration came back, you combined the entrepreneurship and scientific go aheadness with the openness, social openness of the interregnum. And so you got something that was distinctively different from the continent, because everywhere on the continent was still an old fashioned absolute monarchy, whereas Britain, even from 1660, wasn't. And the one very important thing that changed was landholding. Instead of being subject to feudal dues, and held subject to your feudal lord, it became freehold. So you could buy it and sell it and indeed mortgage it. And that once you got the real estate, of course, was the big asset. And once you got that market freed up by the 10 Years Abolition Act of 1660, the Earl of Clarendon deserves a shout out. Then you got an asset that you could sell or mortgage to invest industrially. The first steam engine was built by Thomas Newcomen, and that was fine. He got his first successful one going in 1712. He then set up a marketing company across Britain. He was working under a guy called Savery's patent for various reasons of English patent law I won't go into. And they got a proto merchant bank called the Hollow Sword Blade Company to put out about £20,000 to form a marketing company for Newcomen steam engines. And that was successful enough that by 1733, when the patent ran out, a couple of years after Newcomen died, they had 110 Newcomen steam engines in use across the country, which may not sound a huge number, but France only had 48 in 1816, 85 years later.
Yeah. Martin, let me ask you this, if I may. Not having given you a chance to finish my other long-winded question, I want to ask you about the Bear's Lair and a piece that you wrote. This is about, in fact, it's quite recent. The United States, the headline reads, is no longer a role model. And In this, you contend that hyperregulation in the current administration and what you call Bernankeism, which I like. Yes. On account of these two things, that U.S. productivity growth has now turned firmly negative. Quote, as the Industrial Revolution goes into reverse. Now, from the author of A History of the Industrial Revolution, this is quite an indictment. Could you defend this alarming proposition? The Industrial Revolution is going into reverse. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that the US ability to invent new things and increase productivity has been thwarted. If you like, the factors reducing productivity are now more, as of this year, it could change, are now more powerful than the factors increasing it. Now, one of the factors reducing it is monetary policy. I'm quite convinced that zero interest rates led to all sorts of unproductive investment. And in fact, if you look at the productivity figures for the 2010s, they're pretty grim and get progressively grimmer, except in those last years under Trump when they were bringing interest rates back up to 2%. And I think it's because you get a lot of unproductive investment with zero interest rates. You also get a lot of unproductive investment with government doing the investing. The British high-speed train HS2 is a classic example of that. It's $100 billion or £100 billion, forgive me, and will allow you to travel 15 minutes more quickly from London to Manchester. But it won't stop in between, and it won't make any other journeys significantly quicker. So, I mean, it's just a complete waste of money. And that's what happened when the government directs investment. And I think the US is therefore no longer the beacon of hope, if you like, for people trying to pull up their societies and improve their living standards. And it's no longer the great role model. Where is the great role model? I mean, I think countries that are choosing China are in the process of discovering that's not a good role model either. Singapore, but Singapore's tiny. There isn't another good one.
Yeah. Well, these things do work in cycles, and I have hope, if not ironclad expectation, that somehow the idea of enterprise and the idea of money and the old Kentuckians' notion of the distinction between capital and bank credit, these sacred, secularly sacred ideas yet might make a comeback. In the meantime, I commend to everyone on this broadcast of Forging Modernity by Martin Hutchinson. I think it's book number 4, including the one you wrote jointly with Mr. Dowd on risk management, which I also own and enjoyed dipping into. It's a good, very fine primer on what's right and what's wrong with risk management and finance. So, Martin, thank you. Thanks for doing all the stuff you do, not excluding Bear's Lair every Monday, faithfully. Never miss a Monday.
Excellent. Well, I'm very glad you read me, and I'm delighted to be on the podcast, and it's most enjoyable. Thank you.
Fabulous. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening. And Grant's Interest Rate Observer is going to lie down on a hammock for a few weeks, but we'll be back. When he's supposed to be coming back here? September 1st. And but the office will be manned by people doing fruitful and productive things, will it not, in the meantime? Yeah, okay, good. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Until next time, Jim Grant on behalf of Grant's Interest Rate Observer of the Air.